Hello, this is Nick Holland, Director of Editorial for Information Security Media Group. Welcome to today's session entitled Close the Gap on Insider Threat, Granular Access Controls and Behavior Analytics, featuring Deborah Kish, Executive Vice President, Marketing and Research with Fasoo. Before I introduce our speaker, just a bit of background on today's session. With continued data breaches occurring and heavy fines making headlines, the time is now to think more proactively about applying granular access controls to protect your unstructured data from accidental and malicious data loss. In this webinar, we'll look at typical use cases and demands, in particular data in use where authorized insiders may inadvertently or purposely mishandle sensitive IP or PII, and how using granular rights control and user behavior analytics can close the gap. Before we begin, let me tell you a bit about Information Security Media Group. We currently publish more than 24 international media sites: Bank Info Security and CU Info Security for financial services, Gov Info Security for the public sector, and Healthcare Info Security for the medical community. And then Info Risk Today, about information risk management, Data Breach Today, about breach prevention and response, and Careers Info Security. Each of these sites is dedicated to providing education and news regarding information security, but specifically tailored to their vertical sectors. With over 750,000 members registered to our websites, we have created a true information source tackling the key issues of interest to our unique audience. So on to housekeeping. If you have any questions for our speakers during the course of this session, please submit them via the chat window on your screen. And if anyone should experience any technical issues while viewing today's webinar, please dial the number on your screen. Dial extension 115, as we do have technical support staff standing by. In addition, I want to emphasize that the content being presented in today's webinar is copyrighted material and is meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you or your institution would like to use the information presented in today's session or are looking for customized training education, please contact us. About Fasoo. Fasoo provides unstructured data security and enterprise document platforms that enable our customers to protect, control, trace, and analyze critical business information while enhancing productivity. Fasoo has successfully retained its leadership position in the unstructured data security market by deploying enterprise-wide solutions for more than 1,500 organizations globally, securing more than 2.7 million users. Fasoo is seeing continuous improvement in its global position based on unique technology, ongoing R&D, and strategic approach to our product capabilities. Fasoo's vision is to empower customers with platform technologies to achieve successful digital transformation. To exceed customers' expectations throughout the digital journey, Fasoo is dedicated to deliver exceptional value through our software and services all around the world. There's a relentless focus on innovation and creativity, and will continue to provide solutions to the challenges faced by organizations of all sizes and industries. For more information, please visit https://n.fasoo.com. And now to introduce the subject matter expert for today's presentation, Deborah Kish, Executive Vice President, Marketing and Research at Fasoo. Deborah is responsible for leading Fasoo's research, marketing, and product strategies in the unstructured data security and privacy space. She brings more than 20 years of experience in research with her prior employer, Gartner, where she identified growth patterns, market sizes, and changes in competitive landscapes due to emerging trends and end user needs. For the past 5 years at Gartner, she worked in the technology and service provider security team, responsible for tracking data security technologies and advising thousands of end users and vendor clients. She also monitored privacy regulations and management tools such as consent management and anonymization. And with that, I'll pass the presentation over to Deborah.
Thanks so much, Nick. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining. As Nick said, my name is Deborah Kish, and I am here to present part 2 of the series of 3 webinars. And in this webinar, I will discuss how applying granular access controls and user behavior analytics can close the gap on insider threats. So before I start, I wanted to sort of give a recap from the first webinar where I discussed a simplified approach to protecting unstructured data. And that was to first think about files, or file-centric, so you're no longer dependent on the location of the file. Then I recommended that you encrypt and control access to the files to protect the data itself, not just the folder that it's in. Then to add a persistent file ID to the data, a persistent file identifier that actually stays with the data, never leaves it, so that the data is traceable and meets regulatory compliance requirements. So the reason why I want the listeners to think file-centric is because thinking file-centric actually focuses on the data rather than the location of the data or the rules applied to the data. Remember that folders are fine, and protecting folders is fine, but files, I'm talking about Word documents, CAD drawings, PowerPoint decks, they live inside folders. And files not only leave folders, but they can be manipulated, copied, and saved, perhaps not even in the original applications. So protecting the file eliminates having to chase the data. Doing so also avoids having to implement multiple and complex point solutions across multiple sites. And it avoids conflicting alerts that need to be constantly reconciled. It also means that you don't have to protect every location, every network or device where data travels. In this sense, data protection is now location agnostic. Encrypting files eliminates the need to manage folder access and having to go through an exhaustive setup process that's not infallible, versus encrypting a folder which can actually restrict workflows and maybe halt work projects. Applying access controls gives you the power to allow the right people within your organization to see what they need to see and keep them from seeing things they don't. And the third recommendation, attaching a persistent ID or a unique identifier to the file. Visibility in this respect is increased, and tracing the data is much easier because you don't have to go to each point solution and pull logs or reports. This provides a faster time to respond to regulatory audits. And when you put it all together, a file-centric approach actually streamlines your unstructured data security and privacy initiatives, putting you on the fastest path towards compliance with privacy regulations. And you've now created a foundation for your second and third wave implementations where you might add, for example, user and entity behavior analytics or artificial intelligence or even blockchain. The platform or the actual foundation is there for you and in place. And that brings me to mainly the second bullet with the focus on file access with more granularity. Data in and of itself is a challenge, and protecting data is a challenge in each of its three states. It's at rest, so it's sitting in a database, in a data warehouse, on tapes, in backups offsite. It's in motion, traversing a network, or it's in use, being manipulated and changed on the fly. For data at rest and in motion, for years, we've had products that secure the data in those states. But when data is in use, it's a little tricky because it's in constant state of change. Therefore, it needs additional layers of protection, which is why in the first webinar, we talk about the first line of defense being through classifications and encryption based on policy and those different types of classifications. When data is at rest or traversing a network, if it's encrypted, it's protected. But when a file is open and it's being worked on, shared, or transformed, encryption is no longer in effect. So intellectual property is actually a classic and common example of information at risk. It comes in a variety of form factors like patents, designs, copyrights, trademarks, or trade secrets. And they all have real value to your business. In most cases, it's not just one person who has access to any of it. For example, an engineering group or engineering groups or teams, they may have a collection of files like Microsoft Office, CAD, or images that contain important intellectual property stored in file shares. User access to the files is based on permissions assigned through Active Directory groups. Other internal and external users can't access the shares or documents that are outside the file shares. Editors can easily save or update documents, add new documents to the share, and other members of the engineering group can access them as soon as they're available. And an unauthorized user could attempt to print, copy, paste, or take some other action that might be harmful to the company. The challenges in this scenario are many, but to give you a couple of examples, someone could inadvertently or deliberately send a sensitive document to the wrong person, or someone might save confidential documents to external storage devices, or maybe to unauthorized cloud repositories. Granular access rights applied here creates an environment where users can only access files to which they've been granted permission through Active Directory group assignment. The location of the file doesn't matter. Unauthorized users attempting to access a protected document received an email can't open the document, and inadvertently sent protected documents to the unauthorized recipients. The user or security admin could revoke the document access remotely. We often think of cyber threats or the person behind the cyber threat as the person who looks like the guy on the left side of the slide, attempting to or perhaps at times successfully hacking into your network. These guys usually present in the form of real network hacks, or maybe they attempt a phishing attack hoping someone falls victim to it, which could result in stolen login credentials. But the thing is, I'm not really talking about those guys here. Unfortunately, I'm talking about the people on the right. They look like nice people, and I'm sure they are, but they pose any or all of three different types of threats to your business. So let's focus on those threat types, on those insiders, the people on the right side of that previous slide. They're a threat in three different ways. There's the inadvertent data breach or leak. This is someone who makes a mistake, for example, sending sensitive information to another individual who should not be in receipt of that information. It's accidental. It's a mistake. We all do it. I've done it. Then there's the negligent data breach. So this is the guy where they want to circumvent rules or policies because they just want to get their job done. And then there's the malicious data breach insider. These are the malicious folks who want to actually pose harm on the company, use company information for alternative income streams, or move on to a competitor. And unfortunately, all three exist. It's real. The Google example on the slide here is just one, an engineer copying 14,000 plus internal files and taking them to his new employer, Uber. And unfortunately, the automotive industry, as a matter of fact, is at the highest risk, according to a Deloitte poll. There were also other examples, one in the financial industry. So Morgan Stanley, an employee, took over 700,000 client records. And that actually unfortunately cost Morgan Stanley $1 million as a fine. Merck, the pharmaceutical company, was also a victim of an insider breach where a researcher from a Chinese company stole and sold chemical compounds during a testing phase to sell to a middleman he found on the internet so he can get some money. I think it was something around $7,000 per batch or something like that. Another example, just last year in 2018, Cree, a manufacturing company here in Durham, North Carolina, an employee stole 32,000 files that reflected virtually every aspect of a process which was developed over the past 30 years, possibly to sell to a competitor or a foreign government. What he did was he put records on a micro SD card, but I guess Cree kind of got lucky here because the employee actually dropped that SD card on a sidewalk on campus, and a contractor found it and turned it in. So a lucky day for Cree, but mainly because that information, if you haven't thought about it in terms of how much information is worth to your company, for Cree, the information on that micro SD card was worth over $100 million. And here's the reality of it. I picked up the Poneman IBM recent release on the cost of a data breach, 2019, And human error, unfortunately, is still representing over 1/4 of breaches. And arguably, the malicious or criminal attack, the representation is 51, more than half of it is 51%, likely are inclusive of inside malicious attacks. I don't think that those are all exterior attacks. They're probably also inclusive of malicious insiders. And something to think about here from a cost perspective is that well-publicized hacker-related breaches like the Equifax breach and the Capital One breach that we've been hearing about more recently, we often hear about these because when it's external, when it's an external hack, it has a certain shock value of watching out for the hackers. This is a real problem. Bringing awareness about cyber attacks and the frequency of them, which I don't deny. But rarely do we hear about an insider breach, unless, of course, it becomes a criminal case like the Morgan Stanley example where legal action is taken. These are much more costly than the traditional hacker-related breaches because you know who your perpetrator is, and then you need to start piling on the legal costs. So again, just something to think about. The Poneman report also goes on to say that the percentage chance of experiencing a data breach within 2 years is actually going up. It increased by 2% in 2019. And while that doesn't really sound like a lot, 2%, the issue here is that it's increasing rather than decreasing. So the bottom line here is that you need to be positioned to protect your company and the data in order to prevent the 3 types of insider threats that I mentioned. And the phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, sort of comes to mind here. And how do you do that? How do you protect the company and its data from those 3 types of insider threats? Well, you do it in waves. The first wave is building the foundation by taking a file-centric approach: find, classify, and encrypt. Second wave is applying granular controls. Who can access what, when, and what they can actually do with the data. And the third is through use of user behavior analytics. But what do we mean by granular access controls? Granular permission or access control means that you grant an individual in your organization specific types of actions that they can or cannot perform. This means you can either allow or prevent a person from doing things to a file or in a file when it's open or in use. You can prevent an individual from doing things like copy-pasting, taking a screenshot, or printing, for example, based on the combination of policy and the classification of the file. A user can be either granted or denied specific actions when a document is open. And user behavior analytics can also help you define how those granular access controls are used or can be used. So what is user behavior analytics? I realize that it's a term that many of you are familiar with, so I won't go into too much depth here. But user behavior analytics use packaged analytics to evaluate the activity of users and other things like applications, network traffic, and data repositories. It discovers threats and potential incidents, usually in the form of anomalous behavior or activity based on standard profiles and a baseline of behaviors of users and entities over time. Common use cases are threat detection and response, as well as insider threat detection and response, which is the focus of this webinar. And user behavior analytics can also help you define how to apply granular controls. Let me explain. I can give everyone in my organization permission to do all of those functions on the right: print, view, edit, and so on. However, if I look at the information on the left, or what we might call people-centric information, such as who the user is, the group they're in, the role in their organization, and maybe the time that they typically use the information or what applications they're using. That's the rich context that actually feeds user behavior analytics and will be useful in determining how I set the granular permissions as to who can do what. And dynamic binding of those controls to the context will allow me to change that either as roles in the organization change, people moving from one business unit or a role from one role to another, or if there's unusual activity. For example, I noticed that someone in my business unit is accessing files outside of the typical time frame that they normally do, I can change that access in real time. So together, granular permission using user behavior analytics is a really powerful strategy. You have the data protected through your file-centric approach, but now you use the rich context of the files to further determine what controls should be in place and can change them based on behavior and general changes within the organization. So let me just run through another use case. So this is similar to the Morgan Stanley example that I mentioned earlier. Someone has access, legitimate access to structured data for business purposes. They take it out of that environment and save it into another file or format. Then they walk off with it. The challenges here are how to control authorized users from extracting sensitive data from a structured environment, and then preventing unauthorized sharing of that unstructured data, and maintaining persistent protection of sensitive unstructured data extracted from back-end systems. So with granular access plus UEBA means that you can restrict authorized users from performing specific actions like print, screen capture, etc. And you can use the metadata to monitor user activities with the unstructured files. So now I wanted to give you some visual examples of granular controls in practice. I know these are a little small and might be difficult to see, so my apologies. But to the left, we have watermarking on the screen while a protected document is in use. It's a clear watermark that should a snipping tool or the function control print screen be used, the watermark will show up and the document can't be replicated. Then in the center, so in this case, the file, it's a Word file. The one that's closest is the one that's attempting to receive the paste from a copy-paste action from the protected document that's behind it. So you can't copy from a protected file to an unprotected file. And on the right, for print security, a visible watermark that not only shows up on the printed paper document, but on the screen itself. So in summary, taking a file-centric approach, now you've got your foundation. You need a foundation to build a house, so why not a data security strategy? Your data in use is protected through granular controls, and user behavior analytics is now part of the security equation, and you've closed the security gap. So I wanted to tell you a little about Fasoo. We were founded in 2000, so we've been around for quite a while. As a matter of fact, we're having our 20-year anniversary next year. And in that almost 2 decades, we have helped plenty of organizations with their data security and privacy challenges. We're deployed today in over 1,500 customers globally with millions of users, typically in very large enterprise, large environments. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So Nick, I guess open the lines.
Excellent, yes. So Deborah, got a handful of questions here. First one is, how do I stop someone who had access to files from accessing if they leave?
Aha, that's a good question. So now, if a file-centric approach is actually in place, meaning policies, classification, and encryption, if those have been applied to the files, the easiest way to prevent that person from accessing sensitive information would be simply to remove them from Active Directory. And the reason why I say if a file-centric approach is in place, that's the important part here, because the file-centric approach means that it doesn't matter where the file is. So if somebody's trying to access it, Active Directory just takes them out of the equation. So good question, thanks.
Okay, the next question is relating to the forms of data that we discussed earlier on. So the question is, which form of data is hardest to protect? Is it in motion, in use, or at rest?
Yeah, so like I said before, you know, data in and of itself is a challenge to protect, But the most difficult would be data in motion, because typically what happens is there could be, for example, encryption applied to it. So when a file is open, the encryption sort of goes away. So when data is in use, it's more difficult to protect. So you need those added extra layers of protection, like the granular controls that I talked about, and being able to use the user behavior analytics to actually help determine, you know, how those accesses are granted or how those functions are granted to a specific individual. So good question. Thank you.
Okay. And just one last question then. Can this be built into an automated workflow? Say if I'm doing an automated file ingest from a partner.
Yes. So in a word, yes. Controls can be built into automated processes to protect data as it comes in or goes out. So yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, with that, I think we'll close out the discussion there. So thank you, Deborah Kish from Fasoo. I also want to thank all of our attendees for taking time out of their day to attend this session. And I trust that today's discussion provided some data points to enable your institution to be best prepared to tackle granular access controls and behavior analytics. We hope to see you again at one of our upcoming events. And for Information Security Media Group, I'm Nick Holland. Thank you.